Hi, welcome everyone to today's spring research seminar. Today, the speaker is Dr. Vance Whitaker on the topic of the Hitchhiker's Guide to UF Strawberry Breeding. So Dr. Whitaker received a dual Bachelor's of Science degree from the Horticultural Science and Agricultural Business Management from North Carolina State University in 2003. In 2006, he received his MS in plant breeding from the University of Minnesota. And 3 years later, he earned his PhD from the plant breeding from the same university. In 2009, he joined UF, IFAS Strawberry Breeding and Genetics Lab as an assistant professor. The strawberry breeding program at GCREC, led by Dr. Whitaker, supports Florida strawberry industry by developing disease-resistant, high-yielding, and flavorful strawberry cultivars. This season, a total of 12,000 acres of Florida farmlands are planted with strawberries, resulting at an estimated economic impact of $700 million. 90% of Florida strawberry acreage are planted with cultivars developed by Dr. Whitaker. The most popular of these cultivars is Florida Brilliance, which accounts for 60% of the Florida's acreage. Sweet Sensation, known for its large fruit size and excellent fruit quality, is also popular among growers. Florida Medallion, which is among the newest cultivars from Dr. Whitaker's breeding program, is it's increasing in acreage due to its intense flavor and other excellent fruit qualities. Florida Pearl 109, released in 2020, is the first white fruited strawberry developed by Dr. Whitaker. Pearl's entry into the market gained considerable interest both from social and traditional media, growers and consumers. In early February, Florida Pearl was featured during the Fruit Logistica Trade Fair, the world's leading trade fair for international fresh produce business. The cultivars developed by Dr. Whitaker are not only popular domestically, but also in demand and grown in more than 50 countries around the world. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Whitaker.
Thank you. That was a fantastic introduction, and now I can reduce the talk down a little bit. Let's see. I'm going to maybe need a little help figuring out how to get this PowerPoint up. The mouse doesn't seem to be working for me. I think we're a little frozen up. While he's doing that, you might be interested in the title. If you've ever heard of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's a little bit of an absurdist sci-fi where a guy hitchhikes around the galaxy and is looking for the meaning of, what was it, life, existence, and the universe. And the answer ended up being 42. So it was pretty absurd. I think you're going to get a little bit more information on the answer of, what is the ultimate purpose of the Florida strawberry breeding program this morning. Thus the title. It's a very broad overview. I can only do so much in 30 minutes, but we're going to have plenty of time to interact afterwards, at least 20-25 minutes. So think of your questions, and we'll have plenty of time to discuss them and maybe get into more detail on a few different items. So let's jump right in. First thing I want to do is acknowledge the strawberry breeding team, not only my lab, but Dr. Lee's lab. They're well represented here today. Cheryl, Angel, Sujit's here, all the crew. Thank you guys for everything that you do. And none of this today would be possible without them. No doubt, and I'm going to orient this towards people who maybe know nothing about strawberry breeding. You work on something different. You don't work in breeding. You've probably passed by the strawberry fields many times. This is on the little road that goes to the south of the strawberry fields, this south block right here. And we used to have a tunnel up there in the middle block that we can see. This south block is all breeding material. So when you pass by that, that's all seedlings and selections from the UF breeding program. And that's what strawberries look like in December. It's a very unique growing system, annualized production, where all the water and nutrients come in through these beds right here. And as breeders, we have to pay attention to being good farmers. We have to grow the strawberries the way growers would. And plant well, fertilize well, manage well. Why? Because when we see differences among strawberries, we want those differences to be exhibiting the differences in genetics, not the differences in environment or management, right? And so a lot of breeding is about teasing those things out. Sometimes in very simple ways, because you want to make sure that your plots are uniform, and other times in more complex ways when you're actually using quantitative genetics to parse out the variances that are due to genetics, environment, genotype by environment interaction, and different types of genetic components and so forth. So, but it all comes down to how well we grow and manage these plots. So that's why I want to give a shout out to everybody here from my crew and all the hard work that they do to make sure that we grow strawberries well. So in terms of the meaning of strawberries and of the universe, you have to go back to the beginning. Strawberry has a very fascinating domestication story that needs to be told if you've never heard it before. It involves spies and the military and transcontinental trade. So there are two American species, if you will, of octoploid strawberries, Fragaria chiloensis, which is grown in Chile, as you can tell from the name, but also is native up the west coast of South America, some on the west coast of North America and Hawaii. And then Fragaria virginiana, which is a North American species that was originally collected in the St. Lawrence River area, but is native throughout most of the continental United States, southern Canada, all the way to the Rockies. But the native ranges of these species don't really overlap hardly at all. And so what happened was that English explorers in Canada collected Fragaria virginiana and brought it back to Europe, botanical gardens in Europe. And a French spy spying on the Spanish in Chile collected Fragaria chiloensis and also brought it back to Europe. They ended up side by side in a French botanical garden and hybridized. And Fragaria ananassa is the species that we have today, that it's a hybrid of these two octoploid progenitors. And even today, you can cross Fragaria ananassa with either of these species and get fertile progeny and make breeding progress. So strawberry has a very recent domestication history, about 300 years old. You compare that to something like maize, many thousands of years old, and it gives you a sense that one of the reasons that strawberry is very fun to work with is that there's a lot of wild diversity out there that we're still tapping into. It's a recent domestication. There's a lot in the genome that still needs to get pulled out of the genome, and things that still need to be put into the genome, I think, in order to breed better strawberries. So it's very fun to work on something that's recently domesticated and has a lot of diversity in it and has such a cool story to it. Now, most strawberries for the last several hundred years have been grown mostly in temperate climates. Strawberry is actually a perennial plant. It overwinters, it sends out runners in the spring, and then it flowers, and then it dies back. And this sort of temperate multi-year system is the way most people have grown strawberries, up until, the last century. But more and more, we've moved to this annualized type of culture. And I say not annual because strawberry is not an annual plant. It's a perennial plant, but it's put in an annualized culture. And the reason for that is you can get much higher yields, it turns out, by putting the plants at very high density and replanting them every year. So just for perspective, sometimes in Florida, we can yield up to 6,000 flats per acre, depending on the length of the season. You multiply 5,000 by 8 pounds, is 40,000 pounds of strawberries just on 1 acre. That's an incredible amount of yield. And that's necessary because it's very expensive to make those beds and put that many plants per acre in there. And so, but ultimately, that's a really good high yielding way to grow strawberries. But in order to do that in Florida, we had to adapt a perennial crop into an annualized crop, if you will, and a perennial culture versus an annual culture or annualized culture. It went from matted rows where the runners would go out and the runners would not be trimmed, but just make this thick bed of plants, to raised bed culture where we trim those runners off and we maintain just the original plants. And of course, we had to make something that was a spring summer crop, grow in the winter and yield in the winter. something in a subtropical environment, and something that needed little to no chilling in order to produce its flowers. Again, many perennial crops, they need a certain amount of cold in order to initiate flowers or even to grow vegetative in a proper manner. And so a lot of adaptations had to happen in the late 1800s and early 1900s for strawberries to even be grown in Florida, period. So you have this domestication, which is fairly recent, but created this new species with all this diversity. And then that diversity had to be adapted to so many different climates and regions and production systems worldwide. Of course, one of the most unique ones is here in Florida, where it's a winter crop. And so this is, again, is sort of the big picture of how this happened. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, varieties were being bred and grown in the southeastern United States, and then they were sort of traveling gradually down into Florida, where strawberries were beginning to be grown. Well, breeding started in Florida around 1948. This is a juxtaposition of what it looks like around the turn of the century and what it looked like just about, this picture is about from 10 years ago. This is actually Festival variety on the right. In 1948, a USDA breeder began doing some open pollinated seeds. They weren't making crosses, but they were just growing varieties, and then they were taking the fruit and getting the seeds and growing those seeds out. And that was the early form of breeding that they were using at that time. And they found a seedling in 1948 that was released in 1952 and was called Florida 90. And that was sort of the first Florida strawberry variety, if you will. And since then, the breeding program has sort of been going on and off during that time. So it's a long history of the breeding program, over 75 years now. One of the big focus for the breeding program all the way up really into the early 90s, the main focus of the program was disease resistance, because again, you're growing strawberries in an area where they don't really like the soils and climate and fungi of Florida very much. And anthracnose, different species of fungi that cause anthracnose, was really a huge issue. They didn't have the fungicides that we have now back in the 50s and 60s, and they didn't have the resistance that we have now. But that resistance was built up over many years of breeding in a very harsh environment. And so to this day, we have the strongest anthracnose resistance of any breeding program in existence because of that history. And so as a breeding program, you're always building off of what the previous person did. As a breeder, you're always doing off of what the previous breeder did. And if those breeders hadn't built that up over many decades in the program, there's no way that we could be focusing on fruit quality and yield right now, because we'd still be working on some of these basic disease resistances. So that history is very important. Festival in 2000 was the first sort of big variety in Florida that really took a lot of acreage. It took that long, from the late 1940s to the year 2000, to have a really fully successful variety. Really, the first pretty successful variety was Sweet Charlie, which was released in 1992. But it only had a portion of the acreage. It was just too soft to really be grown in huge acreages and be shipped and really work for the industry. Festival was the first one that really could be shipped from Florida to Canada with no problems, and really it caused the industry to expand. After Festival was released in 2000, the industry within a few years went from about 5,000 acres to about 9,000 acres. So that just tells you the impact of a locally bred variety on this local industry. And ever since then, growers have been mostly using, again, varieties that are bred in Florida. Before that, they were using varieties that were mostly bred in California, because in California, strawberries had been bred much longer than in Florida. Into the late 1800s, there was very active breeding going on. Again, in Florida, since the late 1940s. So that's a big difference in the span of time, and that makes a big difference in terms of breeding. So Festival was the first highly successful variety, and then Radiance was an even bigger success that came out in 2008. And it turned out that Radiance not only liked Florida, it liked high tunnel production too. So it started to spread around the world everywhere strawberries were also grown in high tunnels, because that variety was just extremely adaptable and resilient and can grow in those different types of environments. And when you really think about it, Florida is a great place to breed plants that are adaptable to different environments. And if you think about it, why would that be? Well, in Florida, we plant in late September, early October, when it's very, very hot and rains a lot. okay? And then it starts to gradually cool, but it's still quite hot. Then you get into November, December, you get fruit production, but you still get rains. By January, you're getting freezes, okay? And then by the end of the season in March, April, it's extremely hot and wetter again. So it's almost as if the variety has gone through multiple different seasons, but it's only one season. And we select those varieties to produce consistent yield and fruit quality throughout all those extremely varying temperatures, precipitation, and so forth. So when you think about it, growing in a tough environment like Florida is a great place to breed varieties that might be adaptable to other places because of the amount of variability that a strawberry experiences within a single season in Florida. So I think that's why Florida varieties have spread lots of different places around the world where strawberries are grown in the winter and early spring and have done very well because of that variability that they're exposed to within a single season. So Radiance did really well. And ever since then, we've also been trying to breed strawberries that grow well under high tunnel production. Now, let's talk about traits. What are the important traits that we focus on in the program? Well, we focus on flavor a lot. Some people ask me, they said, well, do you breed for higher vitamin C and phenolics and all of those really healthy things? And I say, no, I don't breed for more of that. We may monitor it and maintain it and make sure that we're not losing those compounds. But I said, I'd rather breed a strawberry that tastes better so that you'll eat 2 instead of 1. Because if you eat 2, you'll get twice the nutrients that you would if you had just eaten 1. And that's my philosophy, is that really we need to focus on flavor, because in order to really make this industry successful, we need to keep making sure that just people eat more strawberries. And that's a good thing, because strawberries are already extremely healthy for you. And we want people to eat more of that and less processed foods. Well, strawberry consumption has continued to just steadily increase in the United States. And that's a big reason why this industry has been successful over recent years. And so we have to keep that going. We have to make strawberries better and better so that people will be encouraged to eat more of them. So this is the pictures of one of our trained panels with Dr. Ann Plotto at the USDA. She trains panelists on things like caffeine for bitter and sucrose for sweet and hexanal for green, grassy flavors, and so on. And with all of our advanced selections, usually 10 to 12 in each year, we get very good taste panel data. And so we try to put some level of objectivity, into our sensory evaluations. In the field, when we're tasting seedlings, Cheryl and Luis and I will get the opinions of all of us on a selection before we either select it or don't select it, because of the variability there can be from fruit to fruit, the variability there is in the genetics of our taste buds and the way our brains interact with our taste buds and our olfactory receptors and all of those things. We're trying to get things that a group of people can agree is better. And we're trying to do it as objectively as possible. This is a picture of a consumer panel that's done by Dr. Charlie Sims in food science in Gainesville. We did these for a number of years with over 100 consumers at every sitting. And we satisfied ourselves that this was giving us highly correlated data with the trained panels. And so these days we just do the trained panels because they're a lot cheaper and more efficient to do with a smaller number of people. But again, objectivity. Sweet Sensation, released in 2013, was an example of a variety that benefited from this approach where we really put flavor forward. Sensations, no variety is perfect, and Sensation we knew had certain weaknesses associated with it, but it had great flavor and it had really good fruit size. And as a result, it did end up becoming successful in the Florida industry. Speaking of fruit size, why do we breed bigger strawberries? Well, it's not because we love bigger strawberries, and it's not because people buying strawberries at the supermarket just have to have bigger strawberries. It's because labor cost. Is it more efficient to pick a bunch of little berries or a few larger berries? If you're going to have the same yield but have fewer larger berries, it's going to be a lot more efficient to pick. Every strawberry is planted by hand, harvested by hand, the runners cut by hand, everything is done by hand. And so as a breeder, I have to think through that lens and think about what it takes to harvest and manage a variety, and what are the operations that a person has to do. And I have to constantly think about how to make that more efficient. So larger berries on longer stems with a plant that is less dense and easy to visualize the fruit. All of that is extremely important. So even our selection of plant architecture is mostly based around what causes harvesting to be more efficient. We want fewer runners produced in the fruiting field. Again, because that costs a lot of money. It costs a grower almost $500 an acre every time they send a crew through the field to cut runners. So we need enough runners to produce the plants in the nursery, but not too many for the grower. And that's actually extremely important. We need to have early yield. This is an economic analysis we did with Dr. Guan a few years ago, where the green line is the historical yield curve over the course of the season, and the blue was considered the optimal yield curve. In other words, we could produce a lot more yield in November, December, and January than we currently do, and the market will absorb that, and it will be good for the grower. So early yield is something that we just continue to try to push harder and harder and harder because of the low supply in the U.S. market in November, December, and January, and the fact that the prices are high during that period. So early yield is extremely important for us. That's where Florida Brilliance came in. Florida Brilliance literally yielded 50% more than Radiance did in the November, December period. 50% more. Rarely do you see that kind of breeding gain from one major variety to the next, but that happened with Brilliance. And if we could produce 50% more than Brilliance, the market would take that too. And so we're going to continue to push very hard on early yield. Brilliance also turned out to be easy to harvest because of its bush architecture, turned out to be resilient and had a pretty good disease package. And then the firmness, shape, and so forth were also good. And as a result, a lot of times the most successful variety is not the best for just one or two things. It's the one with the fewest weaknesses. And I think that's a really important sort of thing to realize as a plant breeder, and something to realize just in general in life, that usually the product or the tool or the technology that often sticks is not the one that's not maybe best at one or two things, but it's the thing that maybe is easiest for a person to work with because there's fewer glaring weaknesses associated with it. And I think that's the issue with part of the reason why Brilliance became the major variety in Florida. Medallion then came along. Medallion was an exciting one because it's, according to the taste panels, not according to just Vance's opinion, it's the best flavored variety that we've ever had in Florida. And big shout out to the Lee Lab. This was the first variety that was the product of marker-assisted selection. There's a particular aroma gene called FAD1 that produces a peach or fruity-like aroma. And this is the first variety that has 2 doses of that gene and very high aroma for that particular compound. And you can detect that when you eat this fruit, and it has a very unique flavor, and that's part of the reason why. So that was really exciting for us that occurred, and that we were able to use that kind of technology to improve flavor and a variety that's successful in the industry. Florida Medallion also has very high early yield. Doesn't have the greatest disease resistance, and I just keep telling Dr. Perez, this is just your job security. You know, you need to have one good susceptible control in all your trials, and I'm just going to make sure that you have it. Then came Pearl, the strawberry in reverse with the white flesh and the red seeds. Pretty cool story. So 2012, we got seeds. A friend of mine went to Japan, bought white strawberries in a market, sloughed off the seeds, put them in his luggage, and brought them back to me. Those are self seeds that there's inbreeding depression in strawberry. Those are going to be very stunted, the seedlings, but we were able to get one tiny little seedling. And this was at the time Tomas was making the crosses. And it had 1 or 2 little flowers that had a tiny little bit of pollen. And we were able to make just enough crosses to get a seed of a cross with that stunted seedling and a regular Florida parent. And it turned out that in that seedling family, all the seedlings segregated from completely red to completely white and everything in between. And within 2 back crosses, we got this, something that had the white color and much of the yield and firmness and other characteristics that was needed to produce it commercially. Pine berries, if you will, or white strawberries have existed in sort of wildish forms, you know, small fruit, soft.
but nothing in a commercial format that could be produced in the US and Europe. And that's why it's taken off so much right now. It's just because there's nothing exactly like it that people can eat. Here's a shout out to Angel Arredondo, beautiful picture that she took. This is 1852-66. This is Pineberry 2.0. It's called Pearl 66. A little bit better yield, a little bit better size consistency, disease resistance, and so on. And so we're going to keep trying to produce the next versions of these, just like we do the red varieties. Estimated acreage this year sort of looks like this. Medallion will continue to increase. Sensation will probably go down a little bit. And we're hoping to release 2 new varieties this year. So we're very excited about that. We did recently release a variety called Felicity for high tunnel production in Spain. It's doing really well over there. And so we're pretty excited about that as well. We're trialing every year in Spain because the high tunnels in Spain are a great environment that represents basically high tunnel production in the whole Mediterranean basin. And so it's sort of like our trial area for that region. And that's important because a lot of the funding that comes in to keep the strawberry breeding program comes internationally. So we try to keep that going so that we can keep the program as strong as it can be to support our local growers. And these are the kinds of things that they're doing with Pearl in the EU. So in the EU, they do something very different. When they harvest strawberries, instead of harvesting them directly into the clamshells and then closing it, and then it goes right to the store, they harvest them into open flats, and then they repack them in a packing facility. And so when you do that, that gives you extra flexibility for what you do in that second step, because you can repack in different ways. And this is one example of what that can look like. So right now, white strawberries are mostly being sold in the US and in Europe just as white strawberries, because there's not that many of them yet. But there are plans in the next couple of years to do all of these different kinds of formats. And that's pretty exciting that you have a full-size white strawberry that you can pack with a full-size red strawberry and put them actually in the same pack, and they look like they're quite uniform. So that's a lot of fun, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out on the commercial side in the next few years. With the last few minutes that I have, I just want to give you a whirlwind hitchhiker's guide to the breeding cycle and what that looks like. So essentially, we make about 75 to 100 cross combinations every year, and we grow out about 15,000 seedlings from those crosses. And then from those, we generally select about 300 to 400 advanced selections, and that's what you have there at the bottom. And this is an example from 2014 to 2017. It could be any year span, but generally seedlings in the first year after the cross, advanced selections, and then we can use those in another cross as early as 3 years after the original cross was made. So that's what the breeding cycle basically looks like. This is an example of a pedigree. This is Medallion. So we don't make self-pollinations very often, or even full sib crosses, because of inbreeding. We have to avoid that in strawberries. So we're doing this pedigree breeding where we're always avoiding those very close relationships, but taking the breeding program as a whole and carrying it along gradually. And that creates very complex pedigrees. And so you can see that there's some named varieties back in the pedigree, but not that many. That's how you maintain diversity while also moving the population in a direction, as you use enough parents. And actually a really complicated pedigree for me, this is really fun to look at, because a lot of times early in breeding programs, you look at a pedigree of a variety and it's a cross between 2 named varieties. You know, it's a cross between Festival and Radiance or something like that. But once the breeding program becomes more mature, you see this complexity in the background of a lot of selections. So as a breeder, that's a lot of fun to see. Another cool thing about this is that on the very bottom right, you see Fragaria virginiana R. Creek. That's Fragaria virginiana that was collected by Dr. Chandler, the previous breeder's breeding technician in Colorado. And it's the only case so far that we have in the known pedigree a wild species in the background of a variety. We think that's where Medallion gets some of its consistent flowering, where it doesn't gap in yield early in the season. So that was also a really fun thing for us. This is what a strawberry flower looks like up close. These are the anthers where the pollen are. If you take those off and then move pollen from another parent onto that flower, you get a hybrid. And that's essentially what's going on in the greenhouse. 2 full greenhouses during the whole season. The seeds on the outside of those ripening fruit there are the hybrid seeds from a given cross. These are the harvested fruit grouped by cross. You blend those up, extract the seeds out, and germinate them. And this is the next generation. So each little square is a different family. Those are transplanted, and this is a lot of work, right, guys? This is every year this cycle happens. But that's the magic, that's the beauty, that's where all of the genetic diversity gets mixed up and created into new combinations. These are seedlings that are planted in our field nursery in Oregon, and then they start to make runners. Okay, so we don't just grow a plant from seed and then just put that in the ground in the field. No, that plant's juvenile. It's not going to have the same yield pattern as a commercial transplant. And so we run a very expensive nursery operation with a commercial nursery out in Oregon, where we simulate commercial transplants for every single seedling. So we get 2 runner plants off of every seedling, and we plant those side by side in the field. And by doing so, by going to all this work and expense, we can be sure that if that plant is yielding early, it's actually an early yielding plant, not just that it had less juvenility from seed than its neighbor. So this is very important when yield timing is a very important trait. This is a slide put together by Sujit that shows a lot of the loci in the strawberry genome that have been discovered in recent years. When I came nearly 14 years ago, it's kind of crazy during the intro, they said 2009. That's amazing. This was blank. We didn't even know the length of these chromosomes, the locations of the centromeres. We didn't know anything about the strawberry genome. Strawberry genomics has absolutely exploded in recent years. And what's cool now is that we use markers at these different loci in collaboration with Dr. Lee's lab to select the alleles at these genes that we want in the next generation. And what that results in is tests like these. So these are HRM and CASP tests from Dr. Lee's lab that is what we actually use to select the alleles that we want at these disease resistance loci and so forth. A fun example of this is that the red versus white color in the strawberries is controlled by a single gene. It's a mutation in a transcription factor that controls anthocyanin biosynthesis. We collaborated with a large group to document that, and then Dr. Lee's lab made a marker. And now if we cross red by white and we want white seedlings, that's what we get when we select with the marker. So it's a great example of how sometimes there are very simply inherited traits that if you can find the gene involved, you can create a very, very effective breeding tool. Last year, we started with 65,000 seedlings, put them through this marker sieve to stack the deck, if you will, get rid of the seedlings that didn't have the allele combinations we wanted. And we ended up with the 15,000 best to send to the nursery. So a big difference in how strawberries were bred even 10 years ago. And it's very exciting for us. We also do genomic prediction, which is a quantitative genetic, a statistical genetics approach to improve traits that are not controlled by single genes, but by many genes. And I'm running out of time, so I won't really get into that in detail, but just to point out that Luis and also Sujit work together on this, Cheryl now as well. And this is just a technique that's increasing in our program as well as genomic selection. Lastly, I just want to give the perspective that I think a lot of the future for us in the next few years is in phenomics. Dr. Wang is here now. Dr. Amr started working with us first in the geomatics program. Sai Wang is one of the students that first started doing this. Now Kevin Wang's here. But this is just a simple illustration of AI or drones and tractor-based imaging platforms combined with AI can delineate canopies and predict the biomass of the plants. If we wanted the biomass of the plants before this, we have to chop them off and destroy them, and then we don't get any yield for the rest of the season. Now we can estimate it in a non-destructive manner, and we've actually started using in this in the breeding program. What we discovered is, well, you grow a bigger plant, you get more yield. But we don't want a bigger plant. We want more yield on the same size plant. Because if we have a bigger plant, it's harder to harvest, see the fruit. So now we can actually estimate with pretty good accuracy the biomass of the plants. By the way, Cheryl is leading this project for the biomass estimation and the genetics, and essentially scale fruit yield on plant biomass and try to get more fruit yield on a plant biomass basis. That's a whole trait that we could never use in the breeding program before because we didn't have the ability to measure it. Now we do. So it's a really simple example of how phenomics is starting to be used in our program. And I think it'll just continue to be used more and more. So we're very excited about that as well. And I think that's a lot of the future for us. With that, I'm going to end because I was told to try to keep it around 30 minutes so that we have lots of time for discussion, which is always the most fun part anyway. So I'm going to stop right there and take your questions.
Well, you mentioned that there's advantages to breeding strawberries in Florida, right? Because they can adapt to other places. I'm curious because I was recently down there for a whole month. Does this mean that strawberries can be grown throughout Central America and the Caribbean?
So yeah, our varieties are grown in Central America and the Caribbean. The biggest countries right now are Guatemala
In Costa Rica.
and I think Costa Rica. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not a huge amount, but some of the Calototricum disease resistances that we have are needed in those areas. And some of the other varieties that are not bred in environments that have those fungi present have not done as well in those areas. The other thing that those areas have is a lot of rain. And our varieties tend to have, at least decent rain tolerance for the skin of the fruit. So that's probably the second most important reason why our varieties tend to be grown in those areas. And that's also the case in Southeast Asia a little bit too.
Yeah. And I was curious if they adapt well to mountain environments.
Well, mountain environments are even easier because they're cooler. And so
Yeah, they traditionally stay like strawberry production in the Caribbean and Central America sticks to
the
mountain
higher areas, because the more day-night differential you have in temperature, even if the average is very high.
But we can't take these to sea level then in Central America and the Caribbean.
I think so, but the higher you get is always better. You'll get more yield, you get better fruit quality. You'll just get, a lot of advantages.
Thank you.
Good
Hi,
question.
Dr. Whitaker.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Great presentation. And so my question is a personal observation about Florida pearl. And I noticed, I don't know, it's kind of less firm compared to the other strawberries. I mean, the pine berry, it's kind of soft, so to say, compared to the other strawberries. I mean, other varieties that I've tasted. And I want to know if my observation is right. That's one. Then the second question is there a correlation between firmness and the shelf life of a fruit? Because I observed also that in terms of shelf life, when I keep the fruit in the fridge and maybe after some days I discover that the Florida pearl somehow doesn't last long compared to the red strawberries. So this is a personal observation I like to ask. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you, sir.
You're 100% right on both of those. So it is softer. The Japanese strawberries that were in the background of the white, that donated the white color, are much, much softer than a Florida bred strawberry. And so what you're seeing is the fact that it's only the second back cross from that intergression. And so you're carrying along less firmness. And that's absolutely the case. And it is also true that firmness tends to correlate to shelf life pretty well. There's two reasons for that. One is you get more bruising on a softer fruit when you pick it. But the other is that you also tend to get faster water loss in cold storage when the fruit is less firm. It's basically less dense, and you get more water loss as a result. And so the rate of water loss is a big factor in shelf life as well. So the bruising and the water loss, and both of those are the case for that one. So that is absolutely the case. Now, some people say they like that texture, but of course the problem is it makes it more difficult to provide them good quality fruit with that texture. And so that's why I think that it's important to develop these next versions, because, for example, the Pearl 66, the 2.0 version, does have better firmness. Another thing that it also has is it doesn't, the skin doesn't abrade as much as the original Pearl. And that's important because on the white background, if a leaf rubs the fruit or a stem rubs the fruit, or it rubs on, it's moved by the wind and it rubs on the plastic, it creates a dark mark on the fruit that on a red variety, you wouldn't see that once it turns red as well, but you see it on the white fruit. And 66 is less prone to that marking and also that yellowing that you see when the fruit gets overripe. So I think there's lots of little improvements that have to be made on Pearl based on your observations. So yes, you're 100% right. And those things have to be addressed in the breeding.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I know for certain crops like apples, like they purposely go on like kill some of the flowers just so they can have bigger fruits.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering for strawberries, is that something that you also do to, or how do you get the bigger fruit? Is it like a genetics problem or is it more like a labor problem that they have to go thin and remove?
So the great question, I realize I haven't been repeating the questions for Zoom, but the question was, can you remove or thin flowers on a plant to create larger fruit on a strawberry? And is genetics, what's the balance between genetics and management for getting larger fruit? So those are really good questions. So we don't thin fruit just because of the labor involved, but there are some places in the world and production systems where that is done. So for example, in Japan, to try to get really large fruit, they will thin the flowers on the plants and just, baby those plants, in really extreme ways to try to get this one large fruit that then they can sell for like $50 or something like that. So that works out for their system, but it doesn't really for us. And so our improvement of fruit size is really all just genetics. It's increasing the average fruit size, but also selecting away from genotypes that have wider variability in fruit size. Because not only do you want to have large fruit, you want to have large fruit without having small fruit. You don't want variability, like in a pack of strawberries, you want some level of uniformity. Too wide a variation in size, during a pick is not a good thing as well. So we sort of select on both of those, the uniformity, but also increase the average size of the fruit. Turns out fruit size is a very heritable trait. The narrow sense heritability for the breeders out there can be as high as 0.5, 0.6. So it's actually very straightforward to increase fruit size. And that's why fruit size has increased so dramatically over the course of the breeding program. And thankfully, it doesn't seem to have any negative relationships with other traits like sugar or other things. I think essentially, from my observations, what we're doing when we're increasing fruit size is just the plant. If you hold yield steady, you're just producing